Gabaccia, who comes to us from the University of Toronto Scarborough, where she works in international migration history. She's written extensively about food studies and gender and migration, and her most recent book is titled Foreign Relations, A Global History of U.S. Immigration. It won the Salutis Prize, the best book in immigration in history. She's published prolifically in food history, and her most popular book, We Are What We Eat, published in 1998 by Harvard University Press, shows that native populations changed as radically as newcomers, and it's out there actually in the book table for your enjoyment and purchase. Because foodways is such a critical means of understanding our cultural identity, it connects us across oceans and eras. We are always, already, and have always been global and migratory, so please join me in extending a warm welcome to Donna Gabaccia.
Well, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I need also to thank Cassandra and Stephanie and Liz, all the people who made it possible for me to get here, and who appreciated that as a relative outsider to the history of the colonial South in particular, I nevertheless might have something interesting to say, and I hope I will. So, I teach world history. And the rise of world history has really significantly altered the way that I think about the history of migration, the history of natives and newcomers, and the history of food. And I'm going to be talking about all of those things very briefly here this afternoon. World history has changed even the way we tell the history of individual nations, such as the United States. And it's changed how we think about particular events, including events like 1619. In fact, it's the impact of world history on migration and culinary history that gives me the audacity, I guess, to appear here today among scholars who actually know far, far more than I do about colonial Virginia and about Native and African America. So let me begin by saying a few words about world history and a few words about how world history has changed the way I, as an historian, study food and migration. And then I promise I will turn my attention to how these changes matter when our collective goal is to understand 1619 and the very big question of when did we become American? So first of all, what is world history anyway? Over the past 30 years, world history has developed from a field that was mainly taught in secondary schools into an important, usually beginner's course in undergraduate history programs. And at the heart of these elementary introductory world history courses are a commitment to understanding the past over the very long term of human history, over long stretches of time. So for example, when I teach world history, I usually start with the emergence of the first humans on Earth, very, very long time ago, rather than in, say, 1609 or 1492. World historians are also committed to understanding the past on a very large spatial scale, well beyond either the local or the national. So for example, when I teach world history, I usually have a map kind of like that one of the entire world on the screen behind me. And the point of almost every lecture in world history is to demonstrate and to explore how key historical movements, such as migration, empire building, trade, warfare, investment, the expansion of religion, the circulation of ideas, how these large-scale movements created connections among two or more of the continents or macro regions of the world. And indeed, it's those connections among the various parts of the world, and more recently the various countries of the world, that define world history as a field of study. World historians' interest in those connections have made both empire and migration central themes of world history, and that's my entree then into 1619 and Virginia. at that time. So, for a world historian, colonial Virginia is a local place, but it's a local place with global connections. Some of those connections are out there in the British Empire, of course, and in other places in British North America. And you can see some of the world empires of the 16th, 17th, and 18th, 19th centuries on this map. Through those empires, Virginia is also connected to other European empires that already in 1619 were becoming global in their reach. Thus, the map I have up here is not a map of the Atlantic or a map of the United States. Again, it is a world map. And onto this world map, by the way, I would, as a world historian, want to also acknowledge and trace and show the alliances and the conflicts among the original natives of North America in 1619, because those connections also stretch outward from Virginia, inland, northward, southward, and westward. Now, for world historians, 1619 and the arrival that year of African origin slaves is a single event, but it's a single event embedded in a much longer history of migrations that originate in Africa. And what you see on the map here behind me is one representation of the prehistoric migrations that populated the entire Earth 80 to 30,000 years ago. These are the migrations that ultimately, over a very long expanse of time, brought to Virginia and other places in North America the newcomers, who by 1619 are, of course, the natives that we will be discussing. This very long-term view of world migrations forced scholars like me, who once wrote about immigration to the United States, to revise and widen our scholarly field. When I was introduced to immigration history in the 1970s, for example, our focus was almost exclusively on the newcomers from Europe who came in search of land or wage-earning work between 1800 and 1930. So as recent as 30 years ago, there was almost no discussion in U.S. immigration histories of Native Americans, of African Americans, and given the definition of immigrant that was used at that time, neither of those groups qualified for inclusion. The first because they were natives, and the second because they were newcomers, but they were newcomers who had not chosen to come to America. They were forced as slaves across the Atlantic. At that time, believe it or not, even the English newcomers to Jamestown were not always included in immigration history because they weren't poor. They weren't huddled masses. They were settlers, adventurers, explorers, whatever you wanted to call them. But as recently as 30, 40 years ago, this meant that the descendants of the first families of Virginia, most Native Americans and most African Americans, did not have much of a sense of belonging in the so-called nation of immigrants. World history has changed that, and it has made it possible for me to talk about a 1619 and a Virginia that's part of world history. And you'll notice that I no longer talk about immigrants, but about migrants. And I look at migration not just to the United States, but migration that occurs at many times and in many places around the world. In fact, world historians have posited that every documentable human society in the history of humankind has been mobile. But of course, the meanings, the practices, the ways in which migration occur have changed and can be compared across time and space. So we refer to forced migrations, free migrations, temporary migrations, permanent migrations, and all of these have shaped American history. Historians taking this long view of human history have also become interested in mobility as a way of life. For example, among foragers, hunters, gatherers, like the natives of this region, and among nomadic peoples as well. They've sought to understand why it is that agricultural societies always imagine themselves as sedentary and see more mobile people, including hunters and gatherers and nomads, as their enemies, whom they often racialize as inferior and dangerous. World historians, in other words, have made it possible for us to think about people who move around within the United States as part of our histories of migration and food, and to compare the United States as an immigrant society to other places like Argentina, France, South Africa, Australia. The list is a very long one. In fact, one world historian of migration, Patrick Manning, has even described migration and human mobility as the engines of human history and evolution. Now, in this view of the past, 1619, and the question of when people became American is a product of multiple migrations. Indeed, all the people of colonial Virginia had been or were mobile, but they were, of course, also very different types of migrants. For natives, mobility was a way of life, and you see that in their cooking habits and customs, as they shifted from forest to seaside, from hunting to fishing to farming in order to produce their own food. Slaves, of course, are forced migrants, indentured servants, working in very large numbers in the Chesapeake in the 17th and 18th century, were the labor migrants of their era, bringing with them the tastes and the cooking customs of England. And then, of course, there were those European adventurers, soldiers, government, investors, gentlemen, imperial agents, and the like. Precisely because 1619 brought together such varied groups of migrants, it's completely plausible for us to expect that the culinary consequences of 1619 and its mobile participants would also be radically different from the culinary consequences of the mass European immigrations of the 19th century that were once the subject of immigration history itself. And let's focus on that issue now, since these migrations of the 17th century and the 19th century also suggest very different power relations, even in the culinary realm, between natives and newcomers. Under conditions of invasion, colonization, and empire building, such as we see in 1619, relatively small groups of European newcomers quickly acquired and held the balance of power, both militarily and technically. And of course, they used that power, as we know well from history, to impose many dimensions of their own cultures and ways of life on natives, pushing the natives to the margins of society and the brink of extinction, even as they captured large populations of Africans as slaves and coerced impoverished Europeans into work as temporary, unfree, indentured servants. Those newcomer empire builders did not come to America like later immigrants in order to become like the natives. I mean, it would be ridiculous for us to imagine them even doing that. But that suggests the kind of power that we need to think about as we look at what happened in the culinary realm. Obviously, much later, later, in the 19th century, the voluntary movements of European and Asian immigrants that created the United States as a nation of immigrants was, at that time at least, built on the expectation that the newcomers were going to become just like the natives. So this relationship between newcomer and natives, 1619 and later, seems to suggest some very sharply different possibilities for what's going to happen culinarily. Because the culinary change we would expect to find among the natives, the less powerful, in 1619, and in the 19th century, the less powerful were the immigrants, the newcomers. So is the change going to happen of the natives, or is it going to happen among the newcomers? Actually, nothing predictable happened, either in colonial America or in the 19th century. But let's focus on 1619, because the history of food in 17th century colonial British North America provides us, as teachers and as students, with concrete and often quite surprising perspectives on power. While scholars today sometimes argue about whether or not there's a national American cuisine, in and outside of the academy, it's just widely accepted that the way we eat today has multiple roots, including among the least powerful participants in 1619. Our eating habits originate not in Great Britain exclusively, but in Africa, Europe, and the natives' Americas. So some of the most compelling illustrations of what's later called the melting pot associated with immigrant Europeans in the 19th century actually can be found emerging from the pots of cooks and cultivators and eaters in the years after 1619. So viewed from the perspective of culinary history now, the significance of 1619 begins with the first documented arrival of slaves with roots in Africa and the Caribbean. And their arrival initiated, and the word that's always used is encounter, among three of the four largest cultures engaged in what Alfred Crosby has famously termed the Columbian Exchange. In British North America, only the Asians are missing from this encounter, at least in this part of the world. If you're not familiar with this term, the Columbian Exchange, it simply means the flow of plants and animals and microbes across the Atlantic Ocean and beyond that was set in motion by Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 1492. And to this list, a culinary historian might also add flows of local knowledge about local agriculture and about the preparation and processing of foods that before 1492 and before 1619 were only known in particular societies in both the Old World and the New. Now, because this encounter occurred within the context of conquest and the expansion of both slavery and European empires, early modern culinary encounters were never encounters of equals. Nevertheless, I think that Crosby's insistence that it was an exchange that occurred is appropriate and justifiable. Focusing on food forces us to understand in new ways power and its exercise in colonial context. Culinarily, in 1619, the powerful seem less powerful, and the culinarily powerless, including Native Americans and Africans, often enjoy some predictable advantages in influencing what everyone eats. So, whether in Britain's southeastern colonies around here or elsewhere, the culinary Columbian exchange was characterized largely by the introduction to the Americas, and Australia too, of European animals, large and small. Think of horses, sheep, cattle, pigs, chickens. None of those existed in the Americas. And the other side of this exchange was the export from the Americas to Africa, Asia, Australia, and Europe of vegetable crops. Think peppers, tomatoes, corn, potatoes, pineapples, tobacco. None of those things existed in the Old World before 1492. Historians agree that the Columbian exchange dramatically transformed eating and cooking practices on every continent. Nevertheless, the timing and the nature of the groups, the migratory groups, banging up against each other, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in cooperation, almost always produced culinary outcomes that blended old and new. We don't actually find much conquest or assimilation in the culinary realm. Histories of the Columbian exchange have revealed considerable evidence of cultural conservatism and resistance by the natives of both Old and New World, but they've also revealed really rapid acceptance and incorporation of new plants and animals in both places as well. How do we begin to understand these very different dynamics? The very belated acceptance in the 18th century of potatoes by Northern Europeans and of tomatoes by, let's say, Italians is quite well known, as is the uneven and ultimately very thin cultivation of maize or corn as a food crop throughout Europe in the aftermath of the Columbian exchange. Here in the Americas, natives too were almost everywhere resistant to most, not all, they accepted fruits from Europe, but most crops from the Old World. And they were very resistant, especially to the domestication and eating of the largest animals introduced by the Europeans. Now, you've probably read about the well-documented proliferation of sheep that occurred in Mexico, horses in the Great Plains of the United States, and rabbits in Australia. In all those cases, the rapid spread of European animals was as much a product of the absence of natural predators and declining native populations in those areas as the result of epidemic, disease, die-off, and genocide, but it also reflected natives' unwillingness in the Americas to incorporate these very large animals into their eating repertoire, even when they happily accepted, for example, pigs and chickens. Now, it's interesting here also to think about the culinary dynamics here in British North America in comparison to what happened in Spain, in Meso or Central America, in Mexico. Spanish newcomers in Mexico are always described as disliking and disdaining the foods of the natives of that region, and especially what we think of as tortillas, right? These flat breads made of corn that they ate. And in New Spain, the Spanish were actually relatively quickly beginning to make their own kinds of wheat bread because they successfully introduced wheat very early. Elsewhere, however, including here in North America, the same Europeans who at home in Europe refused to consume new American vegetables like potato and corn and tomatoes, when they came here, rather quickly adopted them from the natives. How do we explain that difference? Well, in her comparison of the very different rates of acceptance of New World crops in places like India and China, Sucheta Mazumdar has pointed out the very powerful influence of changing food habits, of hunger, and famine. When you are hungry, you are more willing to experiment. In Europe, in Native America, populations had both fallen sharply prior to and during the Columbian Exchange, in part because of epidemic disease. Think Black Death in Europe, think smallpox in the Americas. That sometimes produced catastrophic temporary collapses in food production among the natives of both of the Americas and Europe. But it also reduced populations who, after the dying was over, could actually feed themselves quite adequately on very familiar foods. Hunger mattered a lot to newcomers to the New World. And the famous starving time, as it's called, in New England, and the recently documented episodes of starvation and cannibalism down here in this part of the world had long-term consequences, including the rapid acceptance of corn as a component of the diet, and it had no real parallel among the Spanish who invaded further south. So British North America saw a far more rapid culinary exchange than occurred in colonial Mexico, to give just one example. In almost all cases, however, both Europeans and natives in North America adopted some new food items of the other, and they usually did so by preparing unfamiliar foods or crops in familiar ways, using familiar technology. And the result is what I have described in my book as hybrid culinary cultures. In the culinary realm, neither conquest nor assimilation was the most common outcome. Instead, we get things like Europeans making pies out of native nuts and, of course, pumpkins, the famous example. And we find natives adopting chickens and later pigs, in part, at first, we think, because they valued their feathers and their fats. And we also find, however, when they start eating the flesh of the chicken and the pigs, natives tended to use traditional cooking techniques. They don't borrow European recipes. They just figure out how to cook the flesh that comes out of those animals in ways they had prepared squirrels, gophers, bears, and the other fleshes of native animals. Natives clearly possessed vastly superior knowledge of their local environments, and that gave them tremendous advantages in their culinary encounters with newcomers. Those newcomers often had no familiarity. They did not know how to grow corn. They did not know how to eat or harvest oysters, and they had to learn it if they didn't want to starve. But hunger was not the only influence on these European newcomers. After 1619, Europeans also quickly learned from natives local knowledge whenever they saw opportunities to turn an imperial profit through the intensive cultivation of a native crop on plantations with the coerced labor of slaves and indentured servants. And I'm sure you all know where I'm going with this. Tobacco had been ingested in a variety of ways in almost all native societies in the America. It became the only New World crop, at least in the early modern period, to be successfully adapted to plantation production by Europeans. And the cultivation of tobacco had already begun before 1619, but we all know what happened once Europeans began to expand exponentially their import of enslaved laborers. It's quite striking to me, as an historian of food, that both Europeans and natives associated and sometimes conflated smoking with food. They both called it eating smoke. But in here, we see a case of European adaptation, but also transformation into a plantation product. And that leads me to my final example. Far more than in the case of Native American-European encounters is historians debate the impact of the African slave trade and of Africans themselves on the transformation of agriculture and diets in British North America. Africans, by the way, were eating the food crops of the Americas long before they got here in 1619. Judith Carney and others have made a powerful argument for the African origins of the kinds of rice cultivated in America and of the knowledge that it takes to grow, to create the technologies of irrigation and rice cooking techniques as well. By contrast, those who study the slave trade insist that slaves from rice-growing areas of Africa arrived too late and in much too small numbers to the Carolinas to have much developed rice cultivation. It seems very clear wherever you stand in this debate, and actually I stand with Carney myself, that Africans introduced food items like okra and yams and sesame. They introduced techniques of cooking massive amounts of green and a taste for pepper, which had arrived much earlier in Africa than in Europe or some other parts of the world. And it's also undeniable that the very hard labor of enslaved Africans as cooks, as cultivators, and as processors of food worked their influence on what Europeans ate as well. Lacking both the power of the Europeans and the local ecological knowledge of the natives, African Americans nevertheless made their own contributions to the Columbian Exchange. So let me end by asking you to think about what this means, and these examples mean, when we turn to the question that's posed over the front door through which we all entered. When did we become American? I think if we look simply at the culinary consequences of the Columbian Exchange, we see pretty good evidence that Native Americans are incorporated into the mix of American foods from a very early date. But given what we know about the subsequent hard struggles over race and racialization in American history, even when we turn to the culinary realm, the place, the position, and the importance of African Americans remains under debate and still unresolved. So, thank you very much for your attention.